This video is part 2 of Chapter 6, Thinking and Intelligence for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. In this part of the chapter, we're going to look at how cognitive scientists have studied the typical ways in which we try to solve problems. Usually we come up with strategies that are in part based on experience and mental shortcuts that have worked for us in the past. So just to start things off, while that may be our typical, there are also things that are algorithmic. In some of the problems that we solve, and I'm kind of thinking of basic mathematics, where there are rules, and if you follow the rules, you will come to the correct answer. So they're algorithmic, step-by-step procedures that guarantee the correct answer to the problem. In contrast, a much more common way in which humans solve the problems that face them is to use what are called heuristics. They're basically mental shortcuts that help us to, most of the time, get to a reasonably good answer to the problem that we're facing. Now, many of these problems that we use heuristics to solve are ill-defined, but not all of them. Many of them, if we thought about the problem in more detail, we would see there is a clear algorithmic way we could solve the problem, but it would be very time-consuming. Or maybe we don't have the expertise. So heuristics tend to give us a quick answer. And in the long run, they tend to be correct, but they may not be. And they can be very, very prone to bias. And this is especially evident in social decision-making. A little bit more about heuristics and the most common ones that cognitive scientists have studied. I mentioned at the outset of this chapter that it's not just psychologists doing this research, but also scientists who study in a field called behavioral economics. Researchers in these areas, whether it's cognitive science or behavioral economics, are really interested in the ways in which regular everyday people make complex decisions, especially when there's a high degree of uncertainty, if not all of the information is readily available, and at the same time, where if the person, A, knew what the algorithm was, and B, had the time and motivation to use an algorithm, that algorithm would lead them to a superior solution in many cases. So they started to identify a variety of heuristics that people usually use when they're making judgments under uncertainty. Anchoring and adjustment is one of these. The example you're given in your text, when you meet a new person, your first impression of that person is going to be the anchor, from which all other judgments about the person will be made. So, no matter how different that person's behavior might be in the future, it's like the anchor holding a boat, and the boat can only move within that sphere of that anchor. So let's say that the first impression a person makes of you is very negative. It's going to be a very long uphill battle for that person to debunk that first impression. Another basic heuristic that we very commonly use is called the working backward heuristic. And in this case, you're attempting to come to a solution for a problem by starting at the goal state and then working backwards. Sometimes this can be an effective strategy, but it does have some blind spots. The example you're given in your textbook is the famous water lilies growing in a pond problem. And basically the rules are this: the water lilies are growing in a pond. They double in area every 24 hours. On the first day of spring, only one lily pad is on the surface. 60 days later, the entire pond is covered. On what day is the pond half covered? If you work backwards with the fact that the pond is completely covered on the 60th day, you can solve the question, or solve the problem. Half of the pond must be covered on the 59th day. Now, for a lot of us, me especially, I'm having flashbacks to taking those long story problem questions and trying to deal with them on big tests like the SAT or the ACT. These were the kind of problems I could never solve just because I don't have that sort of rational kind of mind. But in problems like this, working backwards can point you to the right answer. Another type of heuristic is doing a means-ends analysis, and this involves breaking apart problems into subgroups and working toward each of those subgroups sequentially to get to the goal state. When I have students in my senior research class who they have this really large thing that they have to do over the course of 2 semesters, big research project. So what we try to do is to break the goals. The eventual goal is complete your research project, but we want to break it up such that each sub-goal has to be treated independently, but is a step on the way to the ultimate end. So all of these examples that you've just learned about deal with thinking under uncertainty to some degree. Now, some of the research in this area has taken that even further, of giving people situations where they have to make decisions all the time, where you can never really know what the outcome is going to be. So in the previous examples, there were correct answers for you to come up with those examples. In many cases, we just don't know exactly what outcome is likely. We might know what outcome we want, as in this comic where you have an ad, and I'm sure you've seen ads like this in the past, where they talk about, they provide information to help you try and assess what is a good option and what is a bad option. So weighing these differences in percentages and likelihoods, what it shows is that when we're uncertain what the outcome is going to be, we need to take information and then think about it really critically before we make a decision. So, many, I would wager most of the decisions that we have to make on a day-to-day basis are filled with uncertainty. Like, I have a friend right now who is like, the real estate market is really horrible. I would like to sell my house, but is it a bad idea to try and do it now? That's a classic thinking under uncertainty condition. So humans often, though, in order to keep ourselves from, kind of falling onto the ground and feeling completely out of control and hopeless, we tell ourselves that there is more certainty than there actually is. So human beings tend to have what your authors call an emotional need for certainty. We like to feel like we're right. It gives us more confidence when we make our decisions. We would prefer to know exactly what's going to happen in the future, especially when we're making decisions that are high value or high cost for us. So we would prefer to feel certain. We also have this difficulty called statistical innumeracy, which is basically the inability to make clear, reasoned decisions under uncertainty. We're especially vulnerable in situations where risk is involved. Human beings have shown time and time again to have very limited capacity for evaluating personal and group risk when making decisions. So back to the example here of the diet promises. Humans tend to place too much weight on the 100%. So they're focusing on that sense of confidence and certainty. So basically, participants, when they're faced with this kind of task, they tend to heavily prefer that their satisfaction will be guaranteed. When choosing a medication, for example, one with 100% certainty will actually be far more preferred than one with 99% efficacy. So this certainty illusion tends to influence decision making. People are more likely to choose a product or a service that can guarantee 100% certainty over something with significantly less certainty. They're less likely to do further research or fact-checking. There are lots of advertisements out there where they talk about, 100% of doctors agree, or 90% of doctors agree. We really love that 100%. And as the percentages go down, we tend to turn off our willingness to try something new. Now, this uncertainty also plays into the fact that human beings, even when they're aware of basic probability, like you've probably been exposed at more than one time in your educational history to basic rules of probability. But do you use them in your everyday life to solve problems? Highly unlikely. So basically, just to remind you, probability of an event is a likelihood that that specific event will actually happen. Many of the events that surround us in a given day are uncertain, so we have to guess probabilities. So, concrete example, if I open up my phone and I open the weather app and I want to know how likely is it that it's going to rain at 3 p.m. today. And what they're going to give me is an estimate, is basically a probability estimate of the percentage of my region that is likely to see rain at that time. Now, routinely people misinterpret that data and kind of use it in a more heuristic way to dictate whether or not they take an umbrella or a raincoat with them where they're going. Because our world is uncertain, problem solving and thinking would be improved if we actually used probabilities, which is a super unfun thing to do for lots of us. I don't tend to want to go to probability estimates to make decisions about, whether I should carry an umbrella. I'm going to make my best guess and bring the umbrella, or not, and just live with the outcomes. But there are lots of situations like buying insurance, for example, or what kind of insurance should you buy, where you would be better off if you did a little bit of probability analysis. One of the things that we do tend to do is we attempt to reduce uncertainty, because uncertainty makes human beings anxious. We don't like it. We tend to try and find information that makes us feel certain. So we tend to deal with it by trying to find out how events appear to predict one another. We seem to be very, and we're not the only species that does this, humans look at their world and attempt to find predictors, especially predictors of really, really good things or really, really bad things. The really good things are things you want to approach. The really bad things are things you want to avoid. So it's helpful to us from a survival standpoint to identify predictors of those things. Now, unfortunately, we have a tendency to grab onto potential predictors that may or may not have any relevance whatsoever to the thing we're trying to predict. They just happen to be there. So that is a problem that we face. To deal with these kinds of questions, we tend to test hypotheses, but in a very informal and not particularly carefully controlled way when we're thinking about our world. We usually don't test our hypotheses well, and in the social world especially, we don't always get any feedback as to whether or not our hypotheses were actually confirmed. So what we often end up with is we feel like we were right. So humans have these big blind spots in making judgments where the situation is uncertain, and we would do well if we actually paid attention to probability, but we typically don't. So instead, we do these subjective kinds of tests, these informal tests of our hypotheses, and unfortunately, they leave us very prone to biased judgments. So the primary people who are known in the history of this area of research are cognitive psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who identified a basic set of heuristics that we tend to use to make judgments about the probability of certain outcomes. And these two heuristics are called representativeness and availability. And these heuristics serve us very well, and both Kahneman and Tversky would agree. There's an evolutionary advantage to using these heuristics. They're fast, they're informed by our previous experiences, and they generally lead to good, safe decisions. However, they can lead to bias, mistakes, errors, over categorization, and overgeneralization as well. So a heuristic can lead us basically to a self-confirming place. So you have a heuristic that something is in fact representative of a group, or a heuristic based on what's most recently in your memory. That can lead you to ignore lots of information that's available to you, and instead pay too close attention to things that confirm what the heuristic is saying to you. So let's start with representativeness. Representativeness refers to a judgment shortcut that involves thinking about how likely it is that an object or a person is a member of a particular category. And we often judge that based on how well the object or person fits our prototype for the category. So the more it fits that prototype, the more probable it is that the person is in that category. So this tends to be used because we categorize information automatically. In my social psychology class, I often talk about how human beings are designed, absolutely 100% designed to put things in boxes, to categorize, because it simplifies, organizes, and makes more orderly a very, very messy world. So one of the examples that's very common in this area is you hear about a person, maybe you're given some visual clues like this prompt that can be used in research. And it says, here's Amy, she's 40, and Amy's got a baby strapped to her and a couple of toddlers hanging out and a puppy. Which is more likely, that Amy's a fund manager or a teacher? And people will make the judgment. Now, what tends to sway them is based on the information that they're looking at, they tend to lean in the direction of thinking, teacher. A lot of that has to do with gender norms and expectations, sex role expectations, and also our tendency to believe that women are significantly less likely to deal with money, like being a fund manager. Now, what you would have to do to know whether you're correct, you would actually have to go out and find out what's the base rate in fund management, what's the base rate in teaching, a whole bunch of other information. Another common example, and this is one that your authors gave you, was you hear about a person who likes to write and read and interpret poetry. Which is more likely? This person is a hockey fan, Or this person's an English professor who also likes hockey. And, to solve that problem, you would have to really think about probabilities. Okay, a hockey-loving English professor. How likely is that? Is that more likely than a poet who just likes hockey? English professors are relatively rare. Hockey fans, more so, especially if you're in Canada. So, you have to sort of balance out what you know about base rates before you can make a representativeness judgment that is more accurate. Now, most of the time, when we use the representativeness heuristic, we don't get feedback on whether we're right. We use it, it feels right, and therefore we believe it's right. Now, another kind of problem that's related to this is that's used in cognitive science. It's called the Linda problem, basically because that's the way the prompt was written. Linda's 31 years old, single, outspoken, very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she's deeply concerned about issues of social justice, etc., etc. If you look at the Venn diagram, you have all people active in the feminist movement. You have the yellow one, all people who are working in banks. In the middle is the overlap. So it's like in the previous example, the blue would be hockey fans, the yellow would be English professors, the green would be hockey fans who are English professors. So people who are both active in the feminist movement and who are bank tellers. The probability of hitting the green space, pretty low. Much lower than the probability for either of the other two. So because this one area is a subset of each of the two sets, the probability has to be less than the other two sets. Now, if you go back to some of your math classes in high school, you probably learned this as the conjunction rule and then promptly forgot about the conjunction rule because who wants to learn the conjunction rule? But what it shows is, we tend to think based on information that we're given about people that we know something more about them. And what we miss is the probabilities that would help us to actually make more accurate judgments about who people are most likely to be. Another extension of these heuristics, of the representativeness heuristic, is something called the gambler's fallacy. And this is the belief that chance, or, the essence of gambling is chance, that there's a lot of randomness to it. And the gambler's fallacy is this mistaken belief that the process itself is self-correcting. So many a gambler has a belief that if they just continue playing whatever game it is that they're playing, using their strategies, eventually they will be due to win. That involves an overuse of the representativeness heuristic, because what you're doing is assuming that the likelihood of winning is cumulative, when in fact, in true games of chance, it's not cumulative. The probability of winning is the same every time you play. It's low. So every time I buy a Powerball ticket, my probability of winning is independent. The odds are the same every time I play. It doesn't matter how many times I've played in the past. So this concept in our heads that we believe if we just play long enough that we'll win is completely erroneous. So the classic example from empirical research is having people toss coins and estimate probabilities. And people have a tendency to believe that short sequences, so like 8 coin tosses or spins of a roulette wheel, should reflect the long-term probabilities. when in fact that's not true. Each independent toss, each independent spin of a roulette wheel, the probabilities are the same every single time. Short-term patterns may or may not match the long-term pattern, which is, the long-term pattern is no pattern, it's random. Whereas short-term patterns, like you could toss a coin 8 times and it could come up heads every time. So you're thinking, oh, tails is due. Well, it's not due. It's 50-50 every time you toss the coin. So when we believe these random sequences, whether short or long, they should look random, but they're only random in the totality, not in sequences. In fact, you could have a very long sequence and it looks like there's a bias for heads over tails or tails over heads. If you did it thousands of times, the true randomness would emerge. So people are often really insensitive to that kind of probability assessment. The availability heuristic...
Which should we be more...
Sorry, I hit the button too fast. The availability heuristic is another form. So I will let this video from PSY describe an example, and then we'll talk about it some more.
Afraid of sharks or horses? Before we answer that, let's consider 2 more questions. Which kills more people each year? Car accidents, homicide, and suicide combined, or cancer? And are there more English words that start with the letter R, or do they have R as the 3rd letter? When answering questions like these offhand, we tend to think in terms of examples, and assume that the more examples we can remember, the more common a thing is. Unfortunately, we remember some things much more easily than others, so this availability heuristic can lead us to make really bad assessments of risk. Things that are more commonly and vividly shown in the media, like a violent murder, will be a lot easier to remember than things that are far more common in real life, but aren't as dramatic, like a cancer patient dying peacefully at home. Likewise, thinking of things in familiar ways, like alphabetical order, is a lot easier than new ways, like 3rd letter order. But if we actually count the words, this intuition turns out to be wrong. More than twice as many words have R as the 3rd letter than 1st letter. We can see this same effect happening in public policy. Americans spend 25 times more money fighting terrorism than fighting cancer, even though cancer kills almost 2,000 times as many people. Both policymakers and the public who elect them remember dramatic episodes of terrorism much more readily than boring statistics about cancer, and that's how priorities are set. The only way to avoid this availability bias is to decide based on statistics, not the news. We just can't trust our intuition to realistically calculate risks. So, which causes more deaths, Jaws or My Little Pony? Sorry, sharks, horses are the real killers. If you like this video, please share it and subscribe for updates. You can follow and contact us at Google.
So basically, the availability heuristic involves the bias that enters into our thinking based on what we've most recently experienced or most vividly experienced. So whatever's the most available in memory is the thing that's most likely going to be perceived to be more likely. So for example, a lot of us still have are hearing in the news about Boeing, the aircraft makers, issues with safety in manufacturing. All of those videos of that door plug blowing out on that aircraft, very vivid. So when people go to the airport, it's likely that that's very available in memory for them. And in fact, some people will make decisions not to fly, especially when there has been a recent event in the news and persistent discussion of such an event in the news that elevates the level of risk, despite the problems that Boeing might be facing right now, and the accidents that have occurred for whatever causes. Flying is still overwhelmingly safer than driving by far. in terms of risks of injury and death. So we tend to, our decision making, our judgments about likelihoods tend to just sidestep entirely probabilities and instead focus on what feels right based on what's available. We do have a tendency to over-rely on heuristics, not because we're stupid, but because we need to be efficient. For the most part, heuristics do good things for us. Heuristics are adaptive. They often serve us very, very well, and generally lead us, if not to the correct judgment, at least to a judgment that doesn't get us into any trouble, right? So humans have created, over the course of evolution, this capacity to use mental shortcuts to make decisions that are by and large okay. They also come from what cognitive psychologists call automatic processing, or your authors call it System 1 processing. Automatic processing means you're going to use your existing bank of information and knowledge to quickly process what you're seeing, experiencing, thinking about, without a lot of thinking involved. You're going to make that judgment really fast. Think about times when you've walked into a big room of people and you kind of scan the room and make some judgments on who seems safe, who seems interesting, who can I approach, who should I avoid. And you're doing most of that automatically. You're making very, very quick judgments, and if someone asked you to elaborate, you would likely create some semblance of elaborate reasoning, but that wasn't what you were using to make decisions. Automatic processing is part of this two-tiered processing system. So System 1, automatic processing, versus System 2, which in social psychology we call it effortful processing. Here, your authors are calling it reflective processing. System 2 requires a lot of work. System 1 is fast. It's based on intuitions that we have. It's largely unconscious, whereas effortful processing, or System 2 processing, is really slow. It requires time. It requires motivation. It requires energy. Now, I don't know what your life is like, but my life often moves pretty fast. I don't have a lot of time to sit down and do probability evaluations. So we rely on automatic processing to do a lot of the thinking that we do around the clock during our days. But there are shortcomings. There are problems with the way automatic processing works, especially if we're judging probabilities under circumstances of uncertainty. So if you want to be right more than you want to be fast, you need to use effortful System 2 reflective processing. Now, what are some of the downsides? So there are a lot of things that come from over-reliance on heuristic System 1 automatic processing. And these include such things as confirmation bias, illusory correlations, belief perseverance or perseverance, however you want to pronounce that, and person who reasoning. So we'll start with the confirmation bias.
So where do our beliefs and opinions come from? And how do we make sense of the world that we live in? We like to think that we're able to make judgments and decisions about the world around us in an objective and logical way. But this is not necessarily the case because of the way that our brain processes and stores information. In everyday life, we are exposed to a huge amount of information. And this information differs for everybody because we don't experience life exactly in the same way. And in order for your brain to make sense of the world that you live in and process all of this information, it will use filters and shortcuts. And this is all extremely beneficial because that filter will optimize the information processing. Why do we, for example, during election season, only tend to look for information that paints our favorite political party in a good light, and look for and remember information that will cast our opposing political parties in a negative light? Regardless of what political party you're voting for, you would never go out and Google negative information about them. This phenomenon is known as confirmation bias, which could be described as the human tendency to selectively gather and process information in order to confirm our assumptions and preconceptions, whether they are true or not. Decades of research within psychology and social science have shown that confirmation bias does not only affect how we gather information, but also how we process and remember information. The bottom line is that we as humans tend to weigh evidence that supports our prior belief to a greater degree than evidence that will contradict them. Everybody is biased, it's just part of human nature. So how does this relate to the criminal justice system and forensic science? If we take forensic science as an example, one experiment looked into initial exposure to context at a crime scene, to look at whether or not if you were exposed to a certain type of context initially, would that affect how you make interpretations at a later stage. And this specific experiment considered forensic archaeology and anthropology excavations, where participants were asked to excavate burials with cast skeletal remains that were male, and they were dressed in female clothing. And what happened was that the students who excavated the skeleton that had female clothing, later on when they were asked to assess that skeleton, it affected the way that they interpret that male skeleton, compared to, for example, the control group and the people who were exposed to gender-neutral clothing, showing a difference in the interpretation of that same skeleton. And this is not to say that forensic scientists are bad people doing bad things, but this has to do with the fact that as humans, our brains are subject to limitations. We need to take steps in order to minimize cognitive and confirmation bias in forensic science to the best of our abilities. One proposed way of doing this is to shield forensic examiners from irrelevant contextual information that could be of a biasing nature. For example, if the suspect has confessed prior to you looking at the evidence, you don't necessarily need to have that piece of information when, for example, evaluating the fingerprint or looking at the skeleton. What happens at the crime scene will follow up all the way through court. So if you get it wrong at the beginning, it's most likely going to go wrong all the way. And taking a more holistic approach to these types of phenomena is extremely important in order to understand the whole process. It's not enough to simply just have the knowledge of cognitive biases. Education alone will not combat cognitive biases, but there are procedures that we could implement within the forensic science process that could help us minimize and to some extent control that we don't get affected by these.
So what this video does, and just to back up a little bit, the confirmation bias is very broad. It affects us in pretty much every sort of social judgment decision-making situation that we face. It's a tendency to notice, remember, and even seek out information that confirms your expectations of the world, of other people, etc. So what she's describing here is the way in which confirmation bias can even affect things that seem to be incredibly concrete, like forensic evidence. And what's been found repeatedly is that when forensic investigators, forensic scientists are provided with specific kinds of information, it can sway them even if they don't know it, and usually they don't know it, it can sway their judgments in directions that can eventually be misleading and problematic for the justice system. So procedurally, what's best is to, as she noted, eliminate information that is unnecessary to the actual forensic evaluations that need to be done, like keeping the fingerprint examiner keeping information about the nature of the investigation away from them until their analyses are complete. She also mentioned how in sort of forensic anthropology, judgments about the nature of the evidence in the bones, it can be swayed by the presence of extraneous information. And what can be helpful is to remove that extrinsic information until analysis of the bones is complete, and then add more information later in a more nuanced way, such that the information is not being biased. Another type of problem that we run into because we tend to use heuristics so strongly is something called the illusory correlation. And this is the mistaken idea that two particular variables, whatever they are, and they're typically very memorable variables, are actually predictive of one another when they're not. So, for instance, if we believe there's a relationship between two things, we'll tend to notice and remember and even seek out examples of when these two instances occurred at the same time. So in my research, for example, I study stigma related to people with mental illness. There's a long-standing, inaccurate but persistent belief that people with mental illness are prone to violent behavior. And what people often use to justify that belief is news reports of people with a, quote, history of mental health problems, unquote, committing violent crimes, often very graphic violent crimes. So if the news media highlights those two pieces of information, people start to perceive that they are more commonly linked than they actually are. Another example, and I once got into an argument with an ER nurse over this exact thing. She believed 100% that the emergency room is in utter chaos when there is a full moon. And I just saw a TikTok the other day about veterinary staff saying, oh no, it's a full moon, the animals are going to lose their minds. This is one of those mythological ideas that's actually been debunked experimentally using, wait for it, statistics. There is actually no evidence to suggest that the phases of the moon have any predictive utility in determining how busy emergency rooms are going to be, and even less ability to predict what kinds of accidents, injuries, events are going to occur. What's happening, though, is that people on the staff will tend to notice and remember the weirdest things that happen on the full moon and dismiss or forget the likelihood of those weird things happening across the calendar when the moon is not full. And even those weird events not on a full moon, they may be explained away due to other factors, thus leaving the mythology of the full moon effect intact. Some additional biases include the idea of belief perseverance or belief perseverance, which means it's a belief that's gotten sticky. So we tend to cling to beliefs that we have, even if we're given contradictory evidence. And sometimes the presentation, just the mere presentation of the contradictory evidence, will strengthen the original belief, which seems counterintuitive. If you're given solid evidence that you're wrong, why do you double down and push your belief even farther? Well, part of it is we have a tendency to, we don't want our beliefs about the certainty of the world to be challenged. We want to believe that the beliefs that we have are the right beliefs. So when someone challenges us, think about conversations you've had with people in your life the last decade or so about politics, and how, like, I have people in my family who vote the opposite to me, and the battles that we get into, that we've decided as a family, we just don't talk about politics anymore, because it gets ugly, because we each tend to dig in on our sides of the fence, and challenges to those beliefs tend to magnify. Another type of bias that's based on heuristics is something called person who reasoning. And this involves questioning knowledge, because you know that there's one person that violates the rule. So, for example, if I tell people that the statistics on the relationship between violence and mental illness show, without a shadow of a doubt, that people with mental illness are statistically less likely to commit violent crimes than people who are not living with mental illness. And that's often shocking to people. So overall, the stats win. However, what people will often do is they'll say, yeah, but what about that case that I just read of the person with schizophrenia who murders his entire family? What about that guy? So it's, I know a person who, I know this, I know that. Here's another concrete example. I had a conversation with my mom, and she was talking about, we were talking about autism, and she was like, oh, it's true that people with autism all have some kind of special gift, like math or art or music. And I was like, that's actually not true. The statistics show that while there is a base rate of individuals with those kinds of gifts and special abilities, they're no more common in the world of autism than they are in people who do not have that same diagnosis. So it's pretty much a strong mythology that there's going to be a silver lining for people with autism to have special abilities in those particular domains. What is my mom's response? But my friend Betty has a son who is a math savant. I'm like, well, he is an outlier. He is not representative of the norm. But she'll double down and say, oh, but I know a person who. So that concludes part 2.